In a world of immense civilization, one tends to wonder how most folks in the past, particularly the black folks, perceived things, and how so easy it was for the whites to exploit the black continent of their natural resources, human resources, and even buying the blacks over like commodities from a market into slavery, and giving what in return? That one thing that practically held no value nor was used as a means of exchange in the Western countries, but was primitively used by the blacks, especially in West Africa, as a legal tender replacing the trade by barter system, and was, in most cases, primarily used for the acquisition of commodities with little value. The same was used to fool blacks who, unsuspectingly, gave out their God-given resources for something as little as the cowry shell. It was a foolery, a monumental foolery. The quest for control, dominance and uncanny covetous desire was in play. Anything could go, inasmuch as gain was the only aim. There was no conscience needed, no humanity, no empathy. Pure deceit, cunning, and certainly force were the only applicable rules. The white men didn't come all the way from across the seas to play. The African cowries, therefore, became a valuable weapon. Now come, let's journey into the story of the cowry, the African cowry shells. Welcome to this rarely talked about interesting video segment. How whites fooled the black continent with cowry shells. Before we continue, don't forget to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your every inch of support means a whole lot to us. Across the vast tapestry of African history, few threads are as intriguing, yet as fraught with complexity, as the story of the cowry shell. These seemingly humble seashells, once prized for their beauty and spiritual significance, were thrust into a role far beyond their intended purpose by the arrival of European colonizers. Under the scorching African sun, where baobab trees cast long shadows and savannas stretch boundless, lay a continent humming with intricate trade networks. Wealth wasn't measured in cold metal coins, but in vibrant beads, glistening gold dust, and, surprisingly, humble seashells. These weren't just any shells, mind you, but cowries, smooth ivory curves holding whispers of the ocean within. Their intrinsic value resonated through African cultures, adorning bodies, gracing rituals, and facilitating exchange for centuries. Then, like a rogue wave crashing upon this established shore, came the Europeans. Drawn by whispers of riches, they entered with guns, trinkets, and a peculiar notion that these cowries, mere playthings to their eyes, could bind this vibrant continent to their economic web. And bind it they did, flooding markets with an unending tide of cheap, mass-produced shells. As we delve deeper into the history of cowry shells, which comes with many interesting facts, it will be useful to offer a brief explanation of what they are. Cowry or cowry is the common name for a group of small to large sea snails, marine gastropod mollusks in the family Cypriidae. They are glossily polished, three-dimensional shells with a light beige color. They have open ridges vertically lining the middle. The shells are oval and smooth, with the middle ridges that split the shell being slightly rough. The durable and lightweight characteristics of the shells made them an ideal trading currency. This monetary usage continued until the 20th century. The two main varieties are the Cypria monitor and the Cypria annulus, and they have all the features we might expect from a currency: durability, convenience, divisibility, as well as being easily identifiable. In comparison with foodstuffs, which are perishable, and feathers, which can be damaged by vermin, cowry shells can withstand frequent handling and are small and easy to transport. As they are nearly always the same shape and size, they could also be counted or simply weighed to determine the value of a payment. Cowry shells were traded for goods and services throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, and Oceania, and used as money as early as the 14th century on Africa's western coast. Because the shells were small, portable, and durable, they served as excellent currency and were almost impossible to counterfeit, appearing in standard weights. King Gezo of Dahomey, now modern Benin, said he preferred cowries to gold for this reason: he would always receive a fair price. Now, wasn't that just ignorant? I mean, who in the world would still prefer cowries to gold, after knowing what gold is? The truth is, no one sensible or informed would dare do such a thing. Every cowry that has been used for any purpose in Africa has been imported from the Maldives, a group of islands off the southwest coast of India. This archipelago was the home of one specific type of mollusk, later given the scientific name Monetaria monitor, These small shells come from sea snails that thrive in the rocky shallows across the Indo-Pacific tropical waters. It is no more than the dried shell of some species of sea snails indigenous to that region. Cowries can be sourced from some other parts of the world, but the type which has come to be associated with the Black Continent came from this particular location. Furthermore, cowrie shells have held cultural, economic, and ornamental significance in various cultures. They were the shells most widely used as shell money. And as earlier said, they were most abundant in the Indian Ocean and were collected in the Maldive Islands, in Sri Lanka, along the Indian Malabar coast, in Borneo, and on other East Indian islands, in Maluku in the Pacific, and in various parts of the African coast from Ras Hafun to Mozambique. Cowrie shell money was important in the trade networks of Africa, South Asia, and East Asia. There are roughly about 200 species of cowries in countries across the world. The tiger cowry, being of the mollusk in the family of Cyprinidae, stands as the fairest of them all, and are quite many in the Indian Ocean. Cowrie shells, especially Monetaria moneta, were used for centuries as currency by native Africans. Bertrand Russell, in his book Marriage and Morals, attributed the use of cowrie shells as currency in ancient Egypt to the similarity between shape of the shell and that of female genitalia. After the 1500s, however, the shell's use as currency became even more common. Western nations, chiefly through the slave trade, introduced huge numbers of Maldivian cowries in Africa. The Ghanaian cedi was named after cowrie shells. Starting over 3,000 years ago, cowrie shells, or copies of the shells, were used as Chinese currency. They were also used as means of exchange in India. The preparation of the shells for export took several weeks to be completed, and was almost entirely done by Maldivian women. The mollusks were first fished from the water and then put into sandpits on the seashore. Once the snails had died, the shells were washed many times with seawater and fresh water. After this processing, the cowries became clean, shiny, smooth, and ready for export. Until the 16th century, the cowries had to be transported across the Red Sea to North Africa and across the Sahara Desert to reach West Africa, culminating in a one-year journey. One of the first historical sources on cowrie shells as currency in West Africa dates back to the 14th century, when the explorer and scholar Ibn Battuta saw them in circulation in the Mali Empire, but it gained more prominence in the 16th century, when it was widely used as a legal tender. At this time, the Portuguese reached the Maldives during their explorations of the Indian Ocean, and soon realized the archipelago was the source of the cowries that were so in demand in West African ports. The first Portuguese shipment of Maldivian cowries took place in 1515. From that moment onwards, billions of shells were imported by European traders to West Africa, where they became the shell money of the slave trade. Unfortunately, the impetus for the use of cowries as currency was the slave trade. When the Portuguese, in the course of their worldwide peregrination, discovered the source of the cowries which was used as currency in West Africa, it was as if they had been presented with a jackpot. They acted to control the availability of cowries in West Africa and began to use it as payment for slaves. They shipped in cowries and shipped out slaves, as ever a win-win situation as could be exploited. The cost of a slave in the interior of the continent was very low, less than 200 shells. The individual slave could then be sold on through a chain of buyers as they were sent to the coastal regions from where they were exported, by which time they were exchanged for thousands of cowries. The ferocious beauty of this process is unmatched, as several people along this chain gained something until the Europeans on the coast gained the only valuable thing in this chain: a living, breathing human being with all their incalculable potential. It is often imagined that those transported across the Atlantic were only used as laborers, but it is clear that some of them were exploited for their knowledge and skills which were lost to the region of their birth. In one of the most famous autobiographical slave narratives, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, published in 1789, the author recalls when he was sold in West Africa for 172 little white shells, the size of the fingernail. The price of enslaved people was quoted in cowries, and this constantly increased throughout the period of the transatlantic slave trade, especially during its peak in the 18th century. Enslaved people were often sold many times before reaching the coast and being sold to Europeans. In the 1710s, the price for an enslaved person might have started at 172 cowrie shells in the interior of Africa, But by the time they reached the coast, the price had increased to around 40,000 to 50,000. By the 1770s, the price for an enslaved person reached 160,000 to 176,000 cowries. So as you can imagine, the amount of cowrie shells circulating in the West African economy was enormous. Pitiably, in a place where human beings are bought and sold, reverence for human lives is diminished to such an extent that inanimate objects could be regarded as having a higher status than slaves and treated as such. In addition, due to the enormous increase in the demand of cowrie shells in the 16th century, possessing them became crucial for the acquisition and display of social and political status across Africa. The shells symbolized power, prestige, and wealth. Furthermore, cowries were used as a means of payment across a wide region of West Africa. They could be used to buy groceries and tools, and to pay taxes and tributes to political authorities. Cowries were also used to pay laborers. In the early colonial period in Uganda, British officers received a daily allowance in cowries to buy provisions in the local markets, despite their salaries being paid in European currency. As cowries had a very low unit value, they were also particularly suitable for being used as currency in places where prices and incomes were very low, such as parts of inland West Africa. In 1907, a British colonial officer visited northern Nigeria and reported that in a local market there were items on sale that no existing coin would serve to buy small bowls of water for one cowrie shell. Despite colonization, exploitation and extortion of black continents by the whites, most black communities still remained sentimental to the cowrie shell. This is made evident from the fact that after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1803, the trade of cowries from the Maldives collapsed. But it was soon revitalized around 1819, when European traders started to export huge quantities of palm oil from West Africa, for which African producers and traders demanded to be paid in cowries. During the colonial period, European governments attempted in every way to take cowries out of circulation and replace them with what they considered more civilized mediums of exchange, that is, metal coins and banknotes. This was more difficult than they expected. Cowries were so firmly entrenched in West African exchange systems that a decree from the colonial state was not enough to make people accept a new currency. Moreover, in the early colonial period, it was too expensive for Europeans to mint coins with small enough values to replace cowries and then transport them to Africa. Moreover, in the decades it flourished, the cowrie had a dual function for West Africans. It served as both a legal tender and also assumed the position of spiritual and divine element for the people. Today, cowries are no longer used as currency in Africa, but their impact in the black continent still lingers on. They are still used in rituals and in making ornaments and artistic objects. Women often wore a necklace with one cowrie around their neck or waist as a good luck charm. The cowrie further has a robust symbolic attribute because of its shape, which is aesthetic in nature in bearing semblance to a pregnant woman's belly, thus the symbol of fertility. As a result of its deep symbolism, the cowries are worn by the chief priest of Fiji as a symbol of status and rank, while the Ifa priest and priestess make great use of it in making foretelling. Hence, the present functionality of the cowrie relies merely on its supernatural properties, having no financial role in economics. In conclusion, the whites could be said to have cowed the black continent through the shipping in of the blacks' most revered cowrie shells in millions, and happily using them to purchase strong and able-bodied blacks as slaves and further reselling them over and over again, till they had amassed great wealth from such individual. In the same vein, the whites, being conscious of the fact that they had no need for the cowries as it wasn't part of their currency, but got awareness of where to get them from, pounced on the golden opportunity that presented itself to do exploits on the black continent. And since they could get these cowries easily without creating them, they seemed to be practically giving nothing and getting a whole lot in return. Of course, it was a very lucrative business, but at the detriment of the black folks who obviously were oblivious of the fact that they were being fooled and greatly exploited with that one commodity they held so dear, the cowrie shell. This brings us to the end of this video segment, and I hope you learned a few important things out of this. Do not fail to tell us what you think in the comment section below. We are delighted to pick from your thoughts as well as respond to them. Don't forget also to support our efforts by hitting the like button. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Every little support counts a great deal. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned.